let's move to the cloud development announcements. The big focus again with .NET 6 is be able to build anything on the platform, no matter what type of app you're building. .NET, with .NET you can build it, and with Azure you can run it. That's the big message, and it is true. Let's talk about the two different types of applications that Azure is really trying to support. The common pattern that's been around for decades is in-tier applications, where you have some user interface portion that then calls to some other process that's running somewhere else. On the web front, it's a web application, maybe a SPA application that's in a browser, calling over to a server with some web services that then calls over to a database, or a Windows application or a mobile application running on a device that calls via some protocol over to a server, which then calls over to a SQL Server database. And so those have been around for a long time. And we're going to skip the middle ground and go to the pendulum swing, go to the abused microservices. There's a lot of people that have adopted microservices because they've witnessed in-tier applications get really, really large and unwieldy, and they look at it and say, man, this really should be 5 different applications, and we've crammed it all up into one. So if we make a change in one, we have to deploy all of it, and it gets hard to work with. And then with microservices, and there's been a pendulum swing to the other side, where now we can see, we're starting to see stories and case studies where companies create literally hundreds of little programs running around, and they're all trying to coordinate with each other. And whereas the in-tier application that was too big, might have had 1,000 entities and 2,000 classes with business logic that did stuff. Now it's almost like you have 3 or 4 classes per microservice in the cases gone wrong. So the answer is always somewhere in the middle, right? Neither extreme. Everything in moderation. Well, that tends to be true. So if you have an in-tier application that's too large, that has multiple applications trying to get out, well, then absolutely segment it, and segment it down to the part that makes sense for your scenario. And so when you think of microservices, think of the tenets of microservices, not the word micro, which can be misleading, because there's no goal to make an application micro. The goal is to make an application do one thing, and whatever size that happens to end up is okay. But when you do it, it needs to be autonomous. So if you have a Git repository with one of these microservices or one of these smaller applications, it needs to have the user interface components to be able to function. It needs to have the entities and business logic for it to be able to function. And it needs to own the database in order to function. And then, of course, just like any other application, it needs to depend on and be able to call over to other applications that in order to ask it questions or push events, things like that. So coordination. All right. So I just want to quick aside on those, but .NET and Azure supports all of them pretty well. And so the focus on the Azure front is Azure App Service. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Azure Static Web Apps, but Azure Functions is the next one. So Azure App Service is the gorilla in the Azure cloud. You can host everything in there, and it has enough flavors to support. You can have services that just run headless, kind of behind the scenes, listening to queues, or maybe all they are is some web services, and that's fine. You have full-on web applications where 100% of the user interface is there. You've got all kinds of stuff in Azure App Service, and it works everywhere, Windows and Linux. If you're on .NET Core, .NET 5, .NET 6, then and your application doesn't have any legacy components, well, then it doesn't matter if you're on Windows or Linux, because your app can run equally good in both. Let me jump to Azure Functions. Azure Functions is when you need to be serverless. You absolutely need to be serverless, whether it's you need seamless scale up, or whether you need to be able to go, a few hours with nothing running and have no costs to you. But when something happens, you need to swarm it and have high compute. So your scale is going up and down, up and down, up and down. If you just have a batch job, which is kind of plodding along and processing things, Azure Functions is going to be a distraction for you because it's not meant to run that way. You're better off running it as an Azure app service using one of those service workers. Also, if you need something, if you need high response time, Azure App Service and a worker service is going to give you better response time, because if you're not doing anything, it takes a while for the first instance of your Azure function to start up after you have an event come through. And then with Azure Static Web Apps, that's where you can use blob services to have an HTML website or a Blazor WebAssembly application. That's there, and if the pricing or scale model fits, then that's great, use it. But we still find Azure App Service to be the most flexible for .NET teams.